The goddess laughed like a girl in the library, covering her mouth with her hand, snorting. And 30 priests in white watched this the way one might watch a pallet of bricks fall from the 3rd floor. Because just a second ago, a simple laborer had renounced the sacred sword and the role of a hero and said he just wanted to live. Now let's rewind 5 minutes. A white light blinds him. Daniel Hayes squints. Under his feet is cold marble veined with silver. A rumble fills his ears. Dozens of voices sing in an unfamiliar language, and the singing makes his chest vibrate. It smells of incense and something sweet. Dan opens his eyes. He sees columns, huge ones, taller than any cathedral. They soar upward and fade into a golden mist. All around, people dressed in white are kneeling, about 30 of them. All of them are staring intently at him. Before him, on a velvet cushion, lies a sword. And this sword is beautiful. Not like in the movies, for real. In his 17 years on construction sites, Dan has learned to recognize when something is made with love. This sword is made with love. Every line, every curve of the hilt. Someone spent months crafting it. But behind the sword stands a woman. Tall, her hair the color of cooling copper. Her dress seems to shimmer or breathe, and her eyes are such that Dan looks away. Not out of fear, out of politeness, like when you see someone crying on a bus. She's looking at him, right at him, not past him, right into him, as if she'd been waiting. A man with a gold chain steps forward. He announces that the Mother Goddess Aelis stands before the hero, that the hero will accept the sword, that a journey north awaits him, that 30 kingdoms await his feet, that the world is in danger. Dan looks at the sword, then at his hands. His palms are broad, marked by old cuts from plywood and rebar. The nail on his thumb is still blue from the incident with the hammer back in March. These hands have held tools for 17 years. Not weapons, tools. He looks up at the woman with copper-colored hair and speaks calmly, politely. He says that, with all due respect, he's no expert in this, that he's an expert in something else, that if there's any way to do this without a sword, he'd prefer to just live his life, if such an option exists. The singing stops. Silence hangs in the hall. Dan hears his own breathing. And right then, the priest with the chain turns crimson. He starts talking about duty, about a sacred ritual, about how the 30 kingdoms have invested so much gold in the call to arms that it would be enough for 3 cities. Dan listens and nods. He knows how to listen. 17 years on a construction site taught him one thing. When the boss yells, you have to nod and wait until he runs out of steam, and then get to the point. But the woman with copper-colored hair throws up her hand. The priest chokes on his words. Everyone falls silent. She looks at Dan, and suddenly she bursts out laughing, not like a goddess, like a living person. And that laughter breaks something very old in the hall. The priests exchange glances. Someone drops a candle. Dan stands in the middle of it all and doesn't understand a thing. He remembers the rain. He remembers the headlight in his face. He remembers not being able to brake in time. And his last thought about the closet for Mike. So he's dead. Fine, no hard feelings. But this place definitely isn't from a church pamphlet. Aelis wipes the corner of her eye. She throws a couple of words at the priest. The priest turns so pale that his chain becomes the only splash of color on his face. He tries to object. She repeats it more quietly. And at this quiet repetition, the walls of the hall shudder. Dan feels the vibration through the soles of his shoes. Aelis turns to him. She says he's free, that the sword isn't waiting for him, that she's releasing him from his hero's debt. And then she drops a phrase that makes 30 priests all drop to the floor at once. She'll go with him. Dan blinks. He looks to the left, to the right, back at her. He asks where exactly she's going with him. She replies that she's going the same place he is. He says he doesn't know where he's going yet because he's only been here for about 5 minutes. She nods. She says it doesn't matter. The priest with the chain makes a sound. Not a word. Something between a groan and a sob. Aelis closes her eyes for a second, and the air around her thickens, like before a storm. She says goodbye. Dan doesn't know to whom, but he can feel it. It's the kind of feeling you get when someone at a funeral is clinging on with their last ounce of strength. She opens her eyes and utters a single word: manage. It isn't directed at the priests. It rises upward, through the ceiling, through the golden mist. Somewhere Dan can't see but can sense, like distant thunder. 7 responses come at once, not in words. Dan feels them like 7 heartbeats. Surprise, anger, sadness, acceptance, fear, exhaustion. And the last one, the quietest, like a mother nodding as her grown son leaves home. Then everything falls silent. Aelis's hair fades. Her dress becomes just a dress. She seems to shrink, not in height, in presence. A second ago, she filled the hall with her presence. Now she's just a woman, beautiful, tall, but a woman. She says they need ordinary clothes and a road south. An hour later, they leave the temple. The sword remains on the pillow. No one is holding them back. The priests stand along the corridor in silence, like people on the shore watching a departing ship. They step out onto the road, a real dirt road with ruts from carts. The sun hangs low. It smells of grass and dust. Dan takes 10 steps and freezes. Hills, fields, a forest on the horizon. Not a single power line, not an antenna, not a sound of a motor. Only the wind and the birds. He stands in a strange world next to a creature who, 5 minutes ago, was called the Mother Goddess. No money, no tools, no plan. Aelis freezes beside him. She looks down at her feet. Her face is both focused and bewildered. She says there's a pebble in her shoe. She says it as if she's reporting an event of cosmic proportions. Dan looks at her, at the road, at the sky, back at her. He crouches down, pulls her shoe off her foot, shakes out the pebble. Small, gray, ordinary. He puts the shoe back on. He stands up. She looks up at him. 1,000 years from now, she'll say that it was at that very moment she realized she hadn't been wrong. But that will be 1,000 years from now. For now, they're simply walking south along the road, side by side, in silence. And it's a good silence. They walked south for 3 days. Aelis didn't complain. Not about her feet, not about her thirst, not about the cold nights spent in the fields. But Dan could tell. He'd spent 17 years working with people who would never say they were suffering. He'd learned to read it in other signs, in the way a person shifts their weight from one foot to the other, by how their steps slowed as evening approached, by how their fingers clenched into fists, not out of anger, but out of patience. Aelis endured everything, and she did so with a dignity that Dan had seen in only one place in his life, among the old masons, the ones who work in silence and never ask for a break. On the second evening, he tried to start a fire, or rather, he tried. The flint from the temple storeroom wouldn't obey his hands. He struck stone against stone, but nothing happened. Aelis silently reached out her hand. She snapped her fingers. The dry grass flared up with an even, warm flame. Dan looked at her, then at the fire, then at her again. He said it had been helpful. She nodded, without a smile, with absolute seriousness, like a surgeon who had just performed the most complex operation. He didn't ask how she'd done it, not because he didn't want to know, but because he'd never asked Tony the electrician how he could feel the wiring under the wall either. Some things people just know how to do. By evening on the third day, they saw a village. Dan counted 25 houses, maybe 30. Tile roofs, fences made of poles, a central square with a well, roosters, and the smell of manure. Dan stopped on a hillock and surveyed it all with a foreman's eye. 3 roofs had sagged. On 2 houses, the shutters were hanging by a single hinge. The road through the village was a muddy mess, even though, by his estimate, it hadn't rained for at least a week. So there was a drainage problem. There was no proper drainage system. Water was standing. He saw all this in 30 seconds. Just as he could see on any construction site what needed to be done first. Aelis stood beside him and looked at the village differently. She looked at the people, at the woman hanging laundry, at the old man on the bench, at the two boys herding a goat down the street. She looked at each person as if she were reading a long book. Then she said quietly that this village was called Willowbrook, that 43 families lived here, that the well was 120 years old, that last winter 4 elderly people had died from the cold because their stoves were poorly built. Dan looked at her. He asked how she knew. She replied that she knew every name in every village in the world. Then she paused and added that she used to know that now the names are beginning to melt away, like snow, slowly. Dan didn't press her for what that meant. The look on her face was enough for him. They walked down to the village. A dog was the first to greet them, red-haired and lame. Aelis crouched down and scratched him behind the ear. The dog wagged his tail so hard he trembled all over. Then a man came out, an old man, a big man, with a beard full of crumbs. It was Ezra, the village elder of Willowbrook. He looked at them with the expression villagers everywhere and throughout history use when looking at strangers. Squinting, calculating. Who are they? What do they want? How much trouble they'd brought with them? Dan spoke first. He introduced himself as a simple craftsman. He said he was traveling south with his wife. He said he was good with his hands, that he was looking for a place to stay for a while. The word wife came out easily, too easily for the first time. Aelis, standing nearby, didn't flinch. She didn't correct him. She tilted her head slightly, as if trying the word on for size. Ezra looked at his hands. Those hands told the village elder more than any words could. Calluses, scars, a blue fingernail. These were the hands of a man who works, not a trader, not a thief, a worker. Ezra grunted. He said there was a little house on the edge of the village, a former guardhouse. It's been empty for 3 years. The roof leaks, the walls were still standing. If the craftsman fixed it himself, he could live there. In exchange, Ezra wanted 6 months of work for the village. Whatever they told him to do, he'd do it. Dan didn't haggle. He nodded. They shook hands. The cottage turned out to be in worse shape than Ezra had described. The roof wasn't just leaking, it had sagged in 2 places, and one rafter was cracked. The floor had rotted against the far wall. There was only one window, and it had no shutters. The door would only close if you kicked it from the bottom. The stove was there, but the chimney was clogged. Dan surveyed everything in 10 minutes, silently, hands in his pockets. His eyes darted from the floor to the ceiling and back again. Aelis stood in the center of the room and looked at the spider web in the corner of the ceiling. She said that the spider had lived there for a long time and that it had a name. Then she paused. She frowned. She said that she used to know its name. That spiders don't have names in the human sense, but every living creature has a rate in the fabric of the world, and that thread resonates. And that she could no longer hear its thread. She said this in an even voice, like someone saying they'd lost their keys. But Dan heard what lay beneath her voice. He walked over to her, stood beside her, looked at the spider. "Let's call him Frank," he said. She looked at him, then at the spider, then back at him. And for the first time in 3 days, something shifted in her expression. Not a smile. The beginning of a smile. A shadow of that laughter in the temple. "Frank," she said. "All right. Let it be Frank." That first night, Dan didn't sleep. He was fixing things. The door first, then a shutter for the window made from a plank he found in the shed behind the house. He worked by candlelight. His hands moved as they always did. Measure, fit, secure. His body remembered every movement, but his mind was free. And in that free mind, a single thought kept spinning. He's dead. He's definitely dead. He remembers the headlight and he remembers the blow, and now he's in a world where there's a goddess, and there's a sword on a pillow, and there are 30 kingdoms. And instead of all that, he's fixing a door in a village on the edge of a foreign world. Next to it, a woman who can start a fire with a snap of her fingers and knows the names of all living creatures. Or knew them. And she's not doing well right now. Quietly not doing well. For real. The way people aren't doing well when they've lost something enormous and haven't yet grasped the scale of the loss. He'd seen it before, when Mark from the crew lost his wife. The first week, Mark worked as usual. He joked, he ate, he even laughed. But then, in the second week, he sat down on a curb in the middle of the workday and just froze. For an hour. He didn't cry, he just sat there. And Dan sat down next to him then, silently. He didn't touch him, he didn't speak. He just sat there. An hour later, Mark stood up and went back to work. And that was it. Nothing more was needed. Dan finished the shutter, hung it up, checked it. It was secure. He turned around. Aelis was sitting on the bed, the only bed in the house. She wasn't sleeping. She was looking at him without blinking. He asked how she was, simply, just as he asked everyone on the crew every day. "How are you?" She was silent for 5 seconds. Then she said she was cold. For the first time in 12,000 years, she was cold, and she didn't know what to do about it. Dan took off his outer shirt. He draped it over her shoulders. The shirt was big, coarse. It smelled of sweat and wood. Aelis clung to it the way children cling to a blanket, with both hands. Dan said he'd fix the stove in the morning, that it would be warm, that she needed to sleep now. She nodded. He lay down on the floor by the door. He placed a rolled-up bag under his head. He closed his eyes. His back ached. His knees throbbed. His shoulder pulled. His body was that of a 38-year-old man who had been walking for 3 days on a dirt road without proper food. He fell asleep in 2 minutes. In the morning, the light woke him up. The sun was streaming through the window with the shutter he'd hung up the night before. The shutter was open. Aelis was standing by the window, looking out at the village. Her face had an expression that Dan would see hundreds of times later. Quiet attention, like that of someone looking for the first time at a place that might become home. She turned around. She said that people here get up early, that the woman 3 houses down was already milking her goat, that the old man was sitting on the bench in the same spot as yesterday, that 2 boys were chasing the goat again and the goat didn't want to go. Dan stood up. He cracked his neck. He looked at the floor. Half the floorboards were rotten. He said the first thing to do was the stove, then the floor. Then they'd have to check the roof from the outside. Alice nodded. She asked how she could help. He thought for a moment. He said she could start by fetching some water from the well. She nodded with such seriousness as if he'd asked her to stop an earthquake. She went out. 10 minutes later, she returned with a bucket, wet up to her knees. She said the rope by the well was rotten and the bucket had fallen. She fished it out. She didn't explain how. Dan looked at the bucket. It was full. The water was clear. He took a sip. He grimaced. The water had an aftertaste, metallic and slightly musty. He'd seen this before. It happens when something that shouldn't get into a well does. He didn't say anything, yet, but he made a mental note. The well. Figure it out. Then he turned his attention to the stove. The chimney was clogged with nests and dirt. He cleared it out with a stick wrapped in a rag. He checked the draft. He lit a test fire. The stove started smoking. He found a crack in the masonry. He patched it with clay from the stream bank. He tried again. The draft worked. The smoke rose. The room began to warm up. Aelis stood nearby and watched the fire in the stove the way other people watched the northern lights. She said it was beautiful. Dan looked at the stove. The stove was crooked. The clay was still wet. The damper was rusty. He said it was just a temporary fix, that he'd rebuild it properly later. She shook her head. She said he didn't understand, that for 12,000 years she'd seen fire as an element, as one of the pillars, as an abstract force. And now she saw the fire in the stove, Small, tangible, for a single room, for 2 people, and it was beautiful. Dan didn't know how to respond to that, so he answered as best he could. He said it would be warm by dinner time. It took Dan and Aelis 3 days on foot to reach the village of Willowbrook. The village elder, Ezra, gave them an abandoned house in exchange for 6 months of work. Dan began repairing the house and noticed a problem with the water in the well. Aelis faced domestic hardships for the first time and began to lose her ability to sense the names of living beings. During the first week, Dan fixed everything in the house that could be fixed without proper tools. He propped up a rafter with a log from the woods. He replaced half the floorboards. He didn't have enough boards, so he took down the old fence behind the house. The fence was useless, the floor was more important. He adjusted the door so it would close without a kick. There was only one window left, but now it had a shutter and oiled cloth instead of glass. Glass in Willowbrook cost so much that Dan didn't even bother asking. He realized this from the way Ezra looked at the only glass window in his house, with pride, the way a man looks at a new pickup truck. The tools in the village were poor, the axe was dull, the saw was crooked, there was no hammer at all. There was just a stone on a stick. Dan looked at that stone on a stick and something tightened inside him. Not out of anger, out of professional pain. Like a surgeon who's been asked to operate with a spoon, he went to the blacksmith shop. The blacksmith shop in Willowbrook belonged to a woman named Margaret O'Brien. Everyone called her Maggie. Dan heard her before he saw her. She was scolding her son for pumping the bellows the wrong way. She was scolding him loudly and vividly, with such passion that Dan involuntarily stopped and listened. Then he walked in. Maggie turned around. A large woman with a red face and hands covered in soot. Dan introduced himself. He said he needed a hammer, a normal one, well-balanced, and pliers, and a chisel if she had one. Maggie looked at him the way craftsmen look at people who know the correct names for tools, with respect. She didn't have a decent hammer, but she had some iron and a bellows. Dan asked if he could take a look at the bellows. He did. The bellows were assembled crookedly. The airflow was coming from the wrong side. Because of this, the temperature fluctuated and the metal came out uneven. He didn't tell her that. Not yet. Instead, he asked how much a custom-made hammer would cost. Maggie named a price. Dan didn't have any money. None at all. He asked if he could work it off. Maggie snorted. She asked what he could do. He said he could build things. She said the roof over her blacksmith shop was about to collapse, and if he fixed it, the hammer was his. They shook hands. Dan finished the roof in 2 days. Maggie watched him work, silently. With every passing hour, the silence changed. At first, it was appraising, then surprised, then quiet. When he finished, Maggie gave him the hammer and said the roof had never looked so even. Dan said the roof was fine, nothing special. She looked at him with an expression he recognized. His ex-wife used to look at him exactly the same way when he said that fixing the bathroom was a 2-day job. The hammer felt good in his hand. The balance was decent. Not perfect, but it would do. Dan went back to the house. Aelis was waiting for him. She'd spent the day alone, and it had been quite an experience for her. She was standing in the middle of the room, staring at the table. There was a plate on the table. There was something in the plate. Dan didn't realize right away what it was. It was soup, or what Aelis considered soup. He sat down. He took a bite. It had flavor. A strange one. Not bad, but unlike anything he'd ever eaten before. Every sip evoked a sensation, not a taste, an emotional one. As if someone were hugging you from the inside. As if you'd come home after a long day and the house was warm and someone was waiting for you. Dan finished the bowl. He sat there. He blinked. His eyes were wet. He wasn't crying. His eyes just got wet on their own. Aelis looked at him with concern. She asked if he felt bad. He said no, that it was very good. Too good. She didn't understand. He explained. Soup can't make people feel happy. Soup is food. It's either tasty or not. Nothing more. She frowned. She said she'd put care into it. He said that in this world, people put care into things metaphorically, but she'd put it in literally. And if any of the villagers tried this soup, it would raise questions that would be hard to answer. She was silent. Then she nodded. She said she'd try to make it worse. He looked at her. She said it with absolute seriousness, like an engineer tasked with lowering the quality of a product. He almost smiled. Almost. In the second week, Dan set to work on the well. He remembered the taste of the water. He remembered the question he'd asked himself that first morning. He took a rope from the temple storeroom. It was the only thing they'd taken from there. He set out to take measurements. He walked around the village all day. He studied the slope of the land. He looked at where the houses stood, where the barns stood, where the outhouses were, where the stream flowed, where the meltwater went in the spring. By evening, he had a map drawn on a piece of birch bark. It was crooked, but accurate. And that map told him a story the village hadn't known about itself for 120 years. All the outhouses in Willowbrook were situated higher than the well along the slope. All of them. Every single one. The livestock pens, too. Every time it rained, every spring, every time the snow melted, everything that was supposed to seep into the ground far from the drinking water was flowing straight into it. 120 years. Dan stood in the square with the birch bark in his hands and looked at the well, the beautiful stone well the village took pride in. Ezra approached. He asked what the master was doing. Dan showed him the map. He pointed out the slopes. He showed where everything was flowing from. Ezra looked for a long time. He wasn't a stupid man. He just didn't know. No one knew. The grandfathers didn't know. Not even his great-grandfathers knew. They'd built as best they could, just as everyone else had. Ezra was silent for 10 minutes. They were a heavy 10 minutes. Dan watched the village elder's face change. He saw the stages unfold. Confusion, then understanding, then calculation. How many children had died over these 120 years from summer fever? How many old people? How many? And all because the pits aren't in the right place. Ezra asked quietly. He asked if the grandfathers had known. Dan answered calmly. He said the old men did the best they could, that things could be done differently now. He didn't blame anyone. He didn't lecture. He didn't act like he was smarter. He simply stated the fact and offered a solution. To dig new pits further down the slope, below the well, behind the livestock pens. A week's worth of work, maybe 2. Ezra nodded. The next morning, all the men in the village were digging. 26 men, from boys to old men. They dug where the stranger had told them to, because the stranger had shown them a map drawn on birch bark, and the map made sense. Simple, clear, undeniable meaning. Dan dug along with everyone else. He didn't give orders from the hill. He dug, right there, in the mud. His back ached by lunchtime, his knees by evening, his shoulder all night. Aelis stayed home that day. She was learning to wash dishes. The process took her 4 hours. She washed the first 3 plates so clean that they began to glow, literally, with a dim but noticeable golden light. She looked at the glowing plates. Then she closed her eyes. She concentrated. She tried again. The 4th plate didn't glow, but it wasn't clean either. There was a spot left on it. Aelis looked at the spot. She looked at the plate. She looked at the spot again. Her face was like that of a general who had lost a battle. She washed the 4th plate again. The stain disappeared. The plate didn't glow. Aelis set it on the table. She exhaled. She told the empty room that she'd managed it. Frank the spider in the corner of the ceiling didn't react. By the end of the 2nd week, the new pits were ready. The old ones were filled in. The village drank the same water from the same well, but after 2 weeks, the strange taste was gone. After a month, not a single child had come down with summer fever. For the first time in the village's memory, for the first time in 120 years. No one threw a celebration. No one pinned a medal on Dan. But something had changed. When he walked through the village, people greeted him first, not like a stranger, like one of their own. The boys called him Uncle Dan. The old man on the bench started chatting with him about the weather. Maggie brought a pitcher of ale to dinner and thanked him for the roof and everything. Ezra shook his hand and held it for 3 seconds longer than usual. And that evening, Aelis was washing the dishes after dinner, slowly, carefully, without a glimmer. Dan was sitting at the table, sketching something on birch bark. She turned around and spoke to his back. She said she hadn't been able to do in 1,000 years what he'd done in a single day, that she'd made the right choice. He didn't turn around. He said he'd simply shown people where to dig. She said that was the whole point. He remained silent. He kept sketching. On the birch bark were plans for a new stove, for their house, a normal one, with proper draft and a bench. Dan had fixed up the house and received a tool in exchange for repairing the roof at Maggie the blacksmith's. He discovered that the village well was contaminated due to the improper placement of the outhouses and organized their relocation. For the first time in 102 years, the children hadn't come down with summer fever. Aelis is learning household skills and struggling with her divine nature, which makes everything too perfect. Fall came quickly. Dan sensed it before he saw it, in the morning dampness, in the way the wood absorbed moisture, in the way the nails began to rust faster. He knew what the cold meant for a village where half the stoves were built so that half the heat escaped into the wall instead of into the room. He started with his own house. He took apart the old stove completely. He built a new one out of stone and clay. He made the firebox deeper. The chimney was straight. He left an air duct under the floor to heat it. This wasn't an invention. It was knowledge that any decent stove builder in his world possessed. But in Willowbrook, no one had ever seen a stove with an air duct. No one had ever seen a stove where the draft worked so that the fire burned evenly and the smoke didn't drift into the room. When Dan lit the new stove, Aelis stood nearby and watched. Half an hour later, the room had warmed up. The floor beneath her feet grew warm. Aelis took off her shoes. She stood barefoot on the floor. She closed her eyes. She stood like that for a minute. Then she opened her eyes and said it was better than being a goddess. Dan looked at her. She wasn't joking. Word of the stove spread through the village within a day. Ezra came to take a look. He stood in the room. He touched the wall by the stove. It was warm. He touched the floor. It was warm. He looked at the chimney. Not a trace of soot on the ceiling. Ezra asked if the master could build one just like it for him. Dan said he could, but the others first. He asked who in the village lived alone, which of the elderly, who had no sons and no helpers. Ezra named 3 people, old woman Una on the western edge, old man Thomas by the mill, and the widow Enid with her 2 little daughters. Dan started with Una. He arrived in the morning. The old woman greeted him with suspicion. A stranger in the house of a lonely old woman? People would talk. Dan said he'd come to fix the stove, that it was free, that Ezra knew about it. Una let him in. The stove in her house was in such a state that Dan was surprised the house hadn't burned down yet. There were gaps in the masonry. A crack ran the entire length of the back wall. The damper was missing entirely. Una had been stoking the stove with the door open and sleeping in the smoke, every winter, for 10 years. Dan silently took the stove apart. Silently, he built a new one. He worked all day. Aelis came by at lunchtime. She brought food for Una, ordinary food, without that divine aftertaste. She'd learned her lesson. Una ate and looked at Aelis. Then she said the master had a beautiful wife. Aelis said thank you with such dignity as if she'd been awarded a medal. That evening, Dan stoked the new stove at Una's house. The old woman sat in her armchair. The heat flowed from the stove in an even wave. Una was silent. Then tears streamed down her face. She didn't say anything. She just sat there and cried, quietly. Dan washed his hands. He gathered his tools. He left. He didn't try to comfort her. He didn't wait for a thank you. Some things don't require words. Then there was Thomas. Then Enid. He spent 2 days at Enid's because he had to build the stove from scratch. The old one had fallen apart during dismantling. Enid's 2 daughters, aged 7 and 5, sat nearby and watched. The younger one asked why the stones didn't fall. Dan explained. He demonstrated the bond of the masonry, how each stone holds the one next to it, how the rows are offset, and how individual stones come together to form a single whole. The girl listened with her mouth agape. Enid stood in the doorway, watching her daughter smile for the first time in a year. Another thing happened during those same weeks. Noriko Tanaka came to the village. She didn't come, she had always been here. It was just that Dan hadn't crossed paths with her before. The herb and potion shop stood at the far end of the village. It was small, with a crooked porch and a peeling sign. Dan stumbled upon it while looking for mint for Aelis. Aelis had said that mint helped her think like a human. He didn't ask for details. The shop was cramped and dark. It smelled so strongly of herbs that Dan's nose started to itch. On the shelves were jars, bags, bundles, and vials. No order, no system. Everything was piled up haphazardly. A woman was sitting behind the counter, 31 years old, dark hair tied in a bun, glasses on her nose. Dan had never seen glasses in this world before. He looked at the glasses with interest. Noriko looked at him without interest. She asked what he wanted. He said mint. She gave him mint. He paid, or rather promised to pay. He still had no money. He started to leave. He stopped at the door, turned around, asked why the shelves were arranged that way. She raised an eyebrow. He explained. The shelves were nailed to the wall opposite the window. Light from the window shone on the back of whoever was standing by the shelves. The jars were in the shadows. To find the right one, you had to pick up each one and hold it up to the light. If the shelves were moved to the wall by the window, the light would fall directly on them. Every jar would be visible. It would cut the search time in half. Noriko looked at him. For a long time. Then she said that her father had nailed the shelves up, that her father had died 2 years ago, that she hadn't changed a thing. Dan nodded. He was silent for a moment. Then he said that if she wanted, he could move the shelves, move them to the other wall, install new brackets, and add a drying cabinet while he's at it. He'd noticed she was drying herbs on a rope hanging from the ceiling. That's a bad way to do it. Dust, moisture, uneven drying. A ventilated drying cabinet would solve that. She asked why he wanted to do that. He said he liked it when things were set up properly. She looked at him for another 10 seconds. Then she said, "All right." He came over the next day. He worked until evening. He moved the shelves. He planed new brackets out of ash wood. Ash is strong. It doesn't rot from moisture. That's important for an herb shelf. Then he started on the drying cabinet. The cabinet took 3 days. The frame is made of square timber. The walls are made of thin boards with slits for air circulation. At the bottom is a tray with charcoal for heat. The shelves inside are removable to accommodate bundles of different thicknesses. While he was working, Noriko sat nearby in silence. On the second day, she spoke up. She asked how he knew about drying. He said he didn't know about drying. He knew about ventilation and temperature. The rest was just logic. She asked exactly how the ventilation worked. He explained. Warm air rises, cold air sinks. If you make the inlet at the bottom and the outlet at the top, you get a constant flow. Dry, warm air passes through the herbs and draws out the moisture. She listened, silently, intently. Then she said it made sense. She said it as if she were offering the highest praise she could possibly give. On the third day, when the cabinet was ready, Noriko placed the first bundle inside. She closed the door. An hour later, she opened it. The bundle had dried perfectly. No loss, no dust. She held it in her hands and looked at it. Then she adjusted her glasses and said that her father had been drying laundry on a clothesline for 40 years. Dan said nothing. Not because he had nothing to say, because sometimes silence is a sign of respect. Noriko put the bundle away. She turned to him. She said she had some ointment for aching joints, that she noticed how he moved around in the evenings. that the ointment was free, behind the closet. He nodded. That evening he came home with mint for Aelis and ointment for himself. Aelis took the mint, she sniffed it, closed her eyes, opened them, asked who this woman was that made him smell like herbs. Her voice was even, too steady. Dan recognized that tone. He recognized it instantly. He'd been married for 5 years. He knew that tone. He said it was Noriko, the herbalist. He'd built shelves for her. Aelis nodded. She said that shelves were a good thing. Her voice was even more even. Dan sat down at the table. He rubbed ointment on his shoulder. The ointment was good. The warmth seeped into his muscle gently and deeply. Aelis stood by the stove and stared into the fire. Her back was straight. Her fingers were clasped in front of her. She had been a goddess for 12,000 years. She held the world together. She knew every name. And right now, she was jealous of a village herbalist because of the scent of mint and dried chamomile, and she couldn't hide it. And Dan saw it, and he pretended not to see it. Because he'd been married for 5 years, and he knew exactly what to do in this situation. Pretend not to notice. Then she turned around and saw that he wasn't noticing, and she took offense that he wasn't noticing. 12,000 years. The Mother Goddess, the 8th pillar. She was offended that her husband hadn't noticed her jealousy. Dan looked up at the ceiling. Frank the spider was sitting in his usual spot. Dan silently agreed with him. Dan built new stoves for the 3 families in the village who needed them most. He met Noriko Tanaka, the herbalist, and built her a drying cabinet and new shelves in exchange for ointment. Aelis learned to cook without the divine touch. For the first time, Aelis felt jealous of Noriko. Winter was approaching, and Dan was preparing the village for the cold. The first snow fell in November. Dan knew winter would be harsh based on 10 signs. The berries on the bushes had withered prematurely. The birds flew south 2 weeks earlier than usual. Old Man Thomas said his knees were aching as they hadn't in 20 years. Dan didn't believe in folk omens, but he believed in aching knees. His own were telling him the same thing. By the time the first snow fell, he had managed to get a lot done. 6 stoves throughout the village. His own, 3 for the elderly, and 2 more for families who came and asked. He didn't turn anyone down. He accepted whatever payment was available. Grain, milk, or labor. One man helped haul stones. Another gave him a barrel of salted fish. By the end of the first month, Dan had stopped keeping track of who owed whom. The village worked as a team. Not because he ordered them to, but because people saw that he was working alongside them and didn't consider himself above them. It snowed for 3 days straight. Thick, wet, heavy. Dan looked at the roof of his house and felt at ease. He'd reinforced the rafters. The pitch was just right. The snow wouldn't pile up. Then he looked at Una's house. That was fine too. Then at Enid's house. Same thing. Then at Maggie's house. And he stopped. The smithy. He had repaired the smithy's roof, after all, but he hadn't touched Maggie's house itself, and the house's roof was in bad shape. Almost flat. A thick layer of snow was already lying on it, sagging the rafters. He'd seen it that morning. After lunch, he went to see Maggie. She was in the blacksmith shop, working. He told her that the roof of her house wouldn't hold if it kept snowing for another 2 days. Maggie looked at him and smiled. She said the roof had been there for 30 years and would last a while longer. Dan said he knew what the rafters looked like a minute before they broke, and that the rafters on her house looked exactly like that. Maggie stopped smiling. They went to take a look. Dan climbed into the attic. He showed her the crack. Maggie was silent. Then she said that her husband had mentioned this crack a year before he died, that he'd been planning to fix it. He didn't get the chance. She'd been living with that crack for 3 years and couldn't bring herself to ask anyone to do what her husband hadn't finished. Dan didn't say anything about it. He said he needed a day and an assistant. Maggie called her oldest son. The boy was 16. His name was Liam. Broad-shouldered, quiet. His hands were big but unsteady, hands that didn't yet know what they were capable of. Dan looked at him and saw himself at 20, just like that, big and not knowing what to do with his strength. They worked all day. Dan showed him. Liam did it. A support for the rafter, reinforcing the ridge, additional sheathing. Dan explained every step, not because Liam asked, because an explanation is a way to make sure someone can do it on their own, without you. That's the main thing he'd learned from 17 years on construction sites. Don't do it for people. Teach them and walk away. By evening, the roof was solid. Liam stood below, looking up at his work. His face wore an expression Dan had seen hundreds of times, on the faces of newbies who'd just done something real for the first time. Pride. Quiet, genuine pride. Maggie stood nearby, watching her son. Then she quickly turned away. Because of the eyes. Because of the dust. Dust, as always. Winter was bearing down. The temperature had dropped lower than anyone could remember. The stream behind the village had frozen over. The well was covered with a crust of ice every morning. Dan had taught the people to do a simple thing, to conserve heat, to seal the cracks, to caulk the windows, to hang animal hides on the doors. Simple things, obvious, but no one had ever told them about these things before. They lived as they lived. They froze as they froze. They lost their elders every winter and thought that was just the way it was supposed to be. That the gods take the weak. Dan didn't believe in gods who take the weak. He believed in poor insulation. In the middle of winter, Aelis came and said she wanted to help. That she couldn't just sit at home. That she needed something to do. Dan thought about it. He said there were lonely old people in the village who didn't go out in the winter. They needed food and firewood brought to them, and someone to check that they were all right. Aelis took it upon herself. Every day she made her rounds to 4 houses. Una, Thomas, old Bertha by the south wall, and lame Olaf, whose leg had been broken by shrapnel 20 years ago and whose bone had healed crookedly. She brought them bread and soup. Plain soup, nothing special. She'd gotten the hang of it. But there was one thing she couldn't control. When she entered an old man's or woman's house, it would get warmer inside. Not from the stove, just warmer. As if the air itself began to take care of the person inside. As if the walls remembered that their job was to protect. Dan noticed. He told her. She frowned. She said she didn't do it on purpose. He said he knew. He said it wasn't a bad thing, that it was like soup. You just had to keep it at a level where people felt the warmth but didn't ask questions. She nodded. Seriously, like a student who'd been given an assignment by a professor. Winter dragged on. Long evenings, short days. Dan worked less. A tree in the frost doesn't like to be disturbed. You can lay stone, but the mortar doesn't set well. In winter, he occupied himself with small tasks. He repaired his tools. He sharpened them. He adjusted them. He prepared materials for spring. In the evenings, he sat at the table and drew up plans. A mill. He wanted a mill. The village had to haul grain 2 days' journey away to be ground. 2 days there, 2 days back. They wasted time. They lost grain along the way. They paid the miller double because the miller knew he was the only one serving 3 villages. A mill in Willowbrook would change everything. He drew in the evenings. Aelis would sit beside him and watch. Sometimes she'd ask, "What's this? Why? Why this angle?" He explained. She listened. She listened the way no one in his life had ever listened, completely. Every word, every pause. He spoke of the gear ratio, and she memorized it. He spoke of the water wheel, and she asked a question that made even him pause and think. She wasn't stupid. She was a being who had been observing the whole world for 12,000 years and was now, for the first time, looking at a single thing, intently and deeply. And it fascinated her. One such evening, she said that his drawings were beautiful. He looked at the birch bark with its curved lines. He said it was a working sketch, not a painting. She said that was precisely where the beauty lay. That he was drawing something that didn't yet exist, and she could already see how that thing would come to life, how the wheel would turn, how the water would fall, how the grain would become flour. She said it was similar to how she had created the world, only she had done it from top to bottom, and he was doing it from the bottom up, and she liked his way better. Dan didn't know what to make of it, such a compliment from a being who had created the world. So he said the mill would be ready by summer if spring came on time. Aelis nodded. Then she moved closer. She rested her head on his shoulder. He froze. Then he continued drawing, with one hand. He didn't move the other, so her head would stay in place. She was warm, not in a divine way, humanly. The warmth of one living body next to another. Snow was falling outside the window. Firewood crackled in the stove. Frank the spider slept in the corner of the ceiling. And Dan thought that if this was what the afterlife was like, then thank you, Fuhr. By the end of winter, Willowbrook hadn't lost a single person, for the first time. Not a single old person died of the cold. Not a single child fell ill. The stoves provided heat. The houses stayed warm. There was food. There was firewood. And there was a craftsman living in the village who, if anything happened, would take a look and say calmly, "We'll figure it out." And he would figure it out. Spring came in March. The snow began to melt. Streams began to flow. And along with spring, the first stranger arrived in Willowbrook. Dan had prepared the village for the harsh winter. He repaired the roof of Maggie's house and began teaching her son Liam how to work with his hands. Aelis began helping lonely elderly people and is learning to control her divine influence. Dan is designing a mill. For the first time in the village's memory, no one died that winter. With the arrival of spring, the first stranger is heading toward the village. The stranger came on foot along the southern road. Dan saw him from the roof of Ezra's house where he was repairing the gutter. A man in a brown monk's robe. His hood was thrown back. His head was shaved. His gait was calm. But Dan noticed two things. First, the boots. The boots were good. Too good for a wandering monk. The leather was soft. The soles weren't worn down. New boots. Second, his hands. The monk walked, fingering his rosary. But his fingers weren't those of a monk. The knuckles on his right hand were worn down. Old calluses, not from prayer, but from something else. Dan had been studying people's hands for 17 years. He could read hands just as Aelis could read names. Those hands had held weapons. Dan came down from the roof. He found Aelis at home. She was baking bread. It was her 4th attempt that week. The first 3 had failed for various reasons. The first loaf turned out so perfect that it gave off a golden glow. She overbaked the second one while trying to make it less perfect. The third one turned out fine, but she forgot the salt and got so upset that the dough for the 4th one rose twice as high as normal from the force of her emotions. The 4th one looked normal so far. Dan told her quickly and quietly, "A monk, not a real one. He might be looking for them. She needs to stay home and not go out." Aelis looked at him. Her eyes changed. For a single second, they became deeper, older. Then they were normal again. She nodded. He left. The monk was already in the square. He was talking to Ezra. His voice was soft. His manners were polite. He introduced himself as Brother Marcus of the Order of the Morning Star. He said he was heading south, that he was looking for shelter for the night, that he could pay with a prayer and a blessing. Ezra was a hospitable man. He offered food and lodging. Brother Marcus thanked him. He sat down on a bench by the well and began to look around. Dan saw how he was looking, not at the houses, not at the people, at the things. At the gutter on Ezra's house, at the new log cabin above the well, at the road through the village that Dan had filled with gravel over the winter and lined with drainage ditches on either side. The monk looked at all this the way a craftsman looks at someone else's work, with understanding. Dan walked over. He sat down next to him on the bench. He introduced himself. Just a craftsman. He'd been living here since the fall. Brother Marcus turned to him. He smiled. He asked how long the craftsman had been in the village. Dan said since the fall. The monk asked where he was from. Dan said from the north. The monk asked which city. Dan named the first city he'd heard from Ezra. The monk nodded. He asked what the craftsman did for a living. Dan began to explain. About gutters. In detail. In great detail. About the angle of the gutter. About the pipe's cross-section. About how important it is to make an overlapping joint rather than a butt joint. About how water behaves at a bend. About the difference between clay and wooden gutters. About why copper is better than both, but expensive. The monk listened. At first, politely. Then, patiently. Then, with the expression of someone who realizes he's been trapped but can't politely extricate himself. Dan spoke for 40 minutes, without stopping, drawing diagrams on the ground with a stick, giving examples, telling stories about specific gutters on specific houses. The monk tried 3 times to ask a question about something else. Each time, Dan steered the conversation back to the gutters. By the 3rd time, the monk gave up. He spent 2 days in the village. Dan was there the whole time, not intrusively, just there. Showing him around the village, talking about drainage, about stoves, about slopes. The monk inspected every house, peered into every yard. Dan knew what he was looking for. Traces of a divine presence. A flicker, heat with no source, things that work too well for this world. But all he saw were ordinary things, well-made ordinary things. A wooden gutter, a stone stove, a well with a new log frame. Nothing divine, just a craftsman, just work. On the 2nd evening, the monk sat by the campfire with Ezra and Dan. He drank Maggie's ale. Dan talked about the mill he planned to build. He sketched a diagram of a water wheel. He explained how the millstones worked. The monk listened with the expression of a man who had come looking for a wolf but found a sheep telling him about grass. In the morning, the monk left. Dan stood by the gate and watched him walk away down the southern road. A figure in brown, back straight, his stride was confident, not a monk's stride. When the figure disappeared behind the hill, Dan went back inside. Aelis was standing by the stove. She had spent 2 days in the attic. She hadn't come out. She hadn't made a sound. She ate the bread that Dan had brought up to her via the ladder. The 4th loaf. It turned out normal. No glow. With salt. She came downstairs and looked at him. She asked if he had left. He nodded. She exhaled. That exhalation contained everything she had been holding in for 2 days. Dan said that the monk wasn't real. That he was from the Order of the Morning Star, that he'd been looking for traces of her presence, that he hadn't found any. She asked how he'd figured that out. He said it was because of his boots. She looked at him. Then she laughed quietly. She said that she'd been reading people's souls for 12,000 years while he reads them by their shoes, and that his method was more reliable. A week after the monk left, a girl came to the village. Not a girl, a young woman. 24 years old, red hair, pants instead of a skirt, a shoulder bag stuffed with papers. She had come from the east, wet, dirty, with a scratch across her entire cheek from a branch. She said her name was Emily Carter. She said she was a cartographer. She said she needed a place to stay, just for a little while. Dan could tell she was lying. Not about her name, that was real. She was lying about it being just for a little while. She had no intention of leaving. She was on the run. You could tell by her eyes, by the way she kept looking over her shoulder, by the way she flinched at loud noises. Dan had seen this before on a construction site. When someone comes to apply for a job but doesn't actually need a job, they just need a place where they won't be found. He didn't ask who she was running from. He said there was a place for her, that the village needed people, that if she knew how to draw maps, she'd find work. Emily looked at him the way people look at someone who isn't used to simplicity, at the fact that someone just steps in to help without asking a lot of questions or setting conditions. She nodded. Her throat tightened. But she didn't cry. Dan respected that. He found her a room in Enid's house. Enid had a spare little room. Enid was happy. Her 2 daughters were thrilled because their aunt in pants draws maps, and that was the most exciting thing that had ever happened in their lives. Emily settled in within a day. The next morning, Dan came to see her, with a piece of birch bark. He said he needed a map of the village, with all the houses, the roads, the slopes, the stream, the well, an accurate map, to plan the mill and the water supply. Emily laid out her tools, rulers, compasses, ink in 3 colors, quills, thin and thick. Dan looked at the tools and felt a kindred spirit, someone who took her tools seriously. She worked for 3 days. She walked every corner of the village. She measured everything. She drew a map that was more accurate than anything Dan had ever seen in this world. Every house, every path, every slope. Dotted lines marked the underground streams she'd identified by the moisture in the soil and the vegetation. Dan looked at the map and realized that Emily Carter was the best cartographer he could find. He told her that, straight out, in front of Ezra, in front of Maggie, in front of everyone who was there. He said she was the best at this of anyone he knew. Emily froze. She blinked. She blinked again. She quickly turned away. Dan pretended not to notice. He was good at not noticing. That evening, Emily came to their house. She met Aelis. Aelis opened the door and Emily stopped in the doorway. She looked at her, then at Dan, then back at Aelis. And she said that Master Dan had an incredibly beautiful wife and that he should cherish her. Aelis smiled. The first woman in the village who hadn't looked at her with suspicion or envy. The first who had simply spoken the truth with such enthusiasm that the walls trembled. Emily stayed in the village, not just for a while, forever. She didn't know that yet, but Dan already knew. He saw the way she looked at the map of Willowbrook, like someone looking at home. A monk from the Order of the Morning Star arrived in the village to search for traces of the divine presence. Dan distracted him with talk of gutters, and the monk left empty-handed. Emily Carter, a fugitive cartographer from the capital, arrived in the village. Dan gave her a job and publicly acknowledged her skill. The village began to grow. Spring was gaining strength. The snow had melted. The stream swelled and flooded the lower trail. Dan looked at the flooded trail and saw not a problem, but an answer. Water. Lots of water. Fast flowing, with a good drop in elevation. The perfect spot for a mill. He began building in April. First, the foundation. Stones from the stream, large, flat, perfect for masonry. He found boulders further downstream where the water had washed them from the bank. He checked every stone, tapped on it. He listened to the sound. A dull sound meant a crack inside. A ringing sound meant it was solid. An old mason named Ralph had taught him that during his 3rd year on the job. Ralph had died 5 years ago of a heart attack right on the job site. Dan remembered his hands, just as broad as his own. Here in Willowbrook, Ralph's hands continued to work, through him. He needed people for the foundation. Dan hired 5. Hired was a big word. He offered them work in exchange for a share of the flour from the future mill. Once the mill was up and running, they would grind for free for the 1st year. All 5 agreed right away. 3 of them were the men for whom he'd built stoves that winter. One was Liam, Maggie's son. The 5th was a stranger from a neighboring village. Young, lean. He said he'd heard about the master builder from Willowbrook who built things that wouldn't break. He wanted to learn. Dan took him on. A crew of 5. Just like home. Just like in Portland. He stood before them on the morning of the first day and felt right at home. For the first time in half a year in this world, he was doing what he was born to do. Not fixing things. Building. From scratch. According to his own blueprint. For specific people. He explained the plan. He showed Emily the map on which he'd marked the spot for the mill. He showed the blueprint. The water wheel. The trough from the stream. The mill chamber with the millstones. A grain storage room. A roof with the right slope. A sloped floor so the flour would flow down to the exit on its own. The 5 of them looked at the blueprint and didn't understand half of it. That was normal. Dan didn't expect them to understand right away. He started with the basics. We dig here. We haul stones from here. We stack them like this. Their hands were working. Their minds would catch up in time. The first week was tough. The ground was wet after winter. The stones were slippery. The mortar wouldn't set. Dan worked alongside the crew, every day, from morning until dark. His back was killing him by lunchtime, his knees by evening, his shoulder all night long. Aelis waited for him at home with hot water in a basin. He didn't ask. She did it on her own. The first time, she heated the water with magic, and it was as hot as molten lead. Dan only managed to dip his finger in and pull it back. She apologized for half an hour. The second time, it worked. The water was hot but bearable. He dipped his feet into the basin and closed his eyes. She sat across from him, watching him. Once she asked if he was in pain. He said he was fine. She said she could see his pain, that before she'd seen the pain of the whole world and it had been abstract. But now she saw the pain of a single person, and it was unbearable. He opened his eyes. He looked at her. He said it wasn't pain, it was fatigue. There's a difference. Pain is when you feel bad. Fatigue is when you've worked hard. Fatigue goes away. She wasn't convinced, but she kept quiet. In the second week of construction, Noriko showed up, uninvited. She brought a small bag. Inside were herbal compresses. For the crew. She said she'd heard the guys were complaining about their backs. Dan took the bag. He said thank you. He handed them out to the crew. The guys applied the compresses, and an hour later they were hauling stones with triple the strength. Noriko stood off to the side and watched. She watched Dan. He didn't see her. Aelis saw her. She was standing on a small hill with a basket of laundry and saw everything. Her face was calm. Then she went home and re-washed all the laundry so thoroughly that Dan's 3 shirts began to glow in the dark. That evening, Dan opened his trunk and saw a soft golden glow. He looked at Aelis. She was sitting by the stove with an expression of absolute innocence. He took out a shirt. It glowed like a nightlight. He said he couldn't wear it like that. She said she'd wash it again, more gently. He said maybe it would be better to just wash it by hand, without any soap. She looked at him. He demonstrated. He drew some water, soap. He scrubbed it with his hands, rinsed it, wringed it out, a regular wash, without divine intervention. She watched his hands, the way they moved, confidently, calmly, as if they knew what to do without a command from his mind. She said she'd try. She tried. It worked. The shirt didn't glow. It was simply clean. Aelis looked at it with the pride of a victorious general. The mill was taking shape. By May, the foundation was in place. By June, the walls were up. Dan built the walls out of stone up to waist height and used timber above that. Stone for water, lumber for wind. A combination known to every builder in his world, but unknown to anyone in this one. The water wheel was the most difficult part. Dan carved it out of oak. Oak is heavy, durable. It doesn't rot in water. He shaped each blade by hand. The angle of the blade determines its efficiency. If it's too straight, the water won't push it. If it's too slanted, the water flows right past it. He found the right angle on his 3rd try. He tested it in the stream. The wheel turned. Slowly, smoothly, with a quiet splash. He stood knee-deep in the water, looking at his wheel and smiling. For the first time in 7 months in this world, he smiled like that, like a craftsman who sees that his creation works. He ordered the millstones from Maggie. 2 round stones. The lower one is stationary. The upper one rotates. Their surfaces are grooved for grinding flour. Maggie had never made millstones before, but she was a blacksmith and knew how to work with stone. Dan gave her a blueprint with the measurements. She looked at the blueprint. She looked at him. She said he was crazy. Then she made the millstones in a week. Perfect. Liam helped. He was still quiet, but his hands had changed. They were more confident, more precise. He was learning every day. Not with words, with his eyes. He watched how Dan did it and repeated the motions. Dan saw this and gave him increasingly difficult tasks. The mill was ready by the end of June. The village gathered to watch, all 43 families. Dan opened the sluice gate. Water gushed into the trough. It struck the blades. The wheel trembled. It turned, slowly, a little more, and then it was going, smoothly, powerfully, with a rumble that could be felt through the ground in his feet. The upper millstone began to turn. Ezra poured in the first grain. The flour began to flow, white, fine, real flour, their own, without a 2-day journey, without overpaying, their own. The village was silent for about 5 seconds. Then Maggie screamed so loud that the crows took flight from the trees, and everyone screamed along with her. Dan stood by the mill, wet up to his knees, tired. His back, his knees, his shoulder, everything ached. Everything was perfect. Aelis stood beside him. She wasn't shouting. She was looking at the mill, then at him, then at the mill. And on her face was that expression he'd seen on the first day at the temple, when she'd looked at him as if he were the answer to a 1,000-year-old question. Only now it was warmer, more human, not the answer to a question, just the husband who had built the mill. Her husband. That evening, Dan couldn't get up from his chair. His legs wouldn't obey him from exhaustion. Aelis brought a basin of warm water, just the right temperature. She lowered his feet into the water. He closed his eyes. She sat next to him on the floor, her head resting on the edge of his knee, in silence. He placed his hand on her hair, copper-colored, warm. They sat like that until the candle burned out. Dan assembled his first crew of 5 men and built the mill in 3 months. The village got its flour without having to make 2-day trips. Noriko brought herbal compresses for the crew, and Aelis grew jealous again. Aelis learned to wash clothes by hand after 3 shirts came out gleaming from her divine diligence. Liam, Maggie's son, is learning the craft. The summer of the second half of the year brought changes. The village was changing. Not quickly, but noticeably. People from neighboring villages began coming to the mill to grind grain. They paid with flour or coins. Willowbrook began to generate income, small but steady. And along with the income came a reputation. A village where it's clean, where children don't get sick, where the mill operates every day, and where the master will fix anything if you ask him to. Dan could feel the attention growing. It bothered him. He didn't want attention. Attention means questions. Questions meant people who dig. People who dig will find answers that are dangerous. He told this to Aelis. She nodded. She said she knew, that she could feel the world around the village tensing up, like threads being pulled tight. She explained. When she was in her place, she saw the world as a fabric. Every person was a thread. Every event was a knot. Now she could see only the nearest threads, 10 miles around, maybe 15. And those threads were stretching toward Willowbrook. People were coming this way, not all of them with good intentions. Dan asked what she suggested. She said nothing, that she trusted him. He looked at her. She said it simply, without any fanfare, like telling her husband that dinner is on the table. Just a fact. I trust you, that's all. He nodded. He sat down at the table. He began to think. He needed protection for the village. Not magical, real protection. You can't build walls. The village is too small. There are no warriors. A militia of farmers is a joke, not protection. But Dan knew one thing. An attack works when the attacker knows what to expect, when the terrain is open, when the defenses are obvious, or when there are no defenses at all. But if the attacker doesn't know what to expect, if the terrain works against him, if every house, every fence, every ditch is placed strategically, then 5 men with pitchforks are as good as 30 soldiers. He took out Emily's map, spread it out on the table. He looked at it for a long time. He thought. Then he began to sketch. A new fence around the village. Not a wall, a fence, made of thick logs, taller than a man, with a single gate on the southern road. Inside the fence, a ditch to drain water. Outside, the ditch is deeper, half a meter, camouflaged by bushes. Not deadly, but a man on horseback would plunge into it, and the horse would break its leg. Beyond the fence lay an empty space. 10 paces. Nothing. Open to view from all sides. Then the houses. But the houses weren't arranged at random. Every passage between the houses was visible from at least 2 windows. Dead ends in the right places. A barn at the eastern edge, a large one, made of stone. Dan built it 3 weeks ago. Ezra thought it was a grain barn. The walls are 3 bricks thick. The door is oak. The windows are narrow. Dan built it as a fortified outpost, just in case. He didn't tell anyone why the walls were so thick. He said it was to preserve the grain. Technically true. The thick walls maintain the temperature. The grain doesn't spoil. But they also stop arrows. Emily noticed. She was the only one who noticed. She came to see him that evening. She unfolded her copy of the map. She pointed at the barn. She said it wasn't just a barn, that she could see the lines of sight, that she was a cartographer and could read the terrain the way he read palms, and that this barn was positioned to control both the eastern approach and the southern gate at the same time. Dan looked at her. She looked back at him without judgment, with understanding. She had fled the capital because her maps were too accurate. She knew what it meant when people took notice of what you were doing. He told her the truth. Not all of it, but part of it. He told her there were people looking for him, that he wasn't a criminal, that he just wanted to live in peace, that the village might be in danger because of him. She was silent. Then she said that before he arrived, the village used to bury the elderly every winter and children every summer, that it doesn't do that anymore, and that if anyone comes for him, she'll draw a map of all the approaches and weak spots and let them try. He nodded. He didn't smile, but something inside him let go. He wasn't alone. They worked together for a week. Emily drew. Dan built. The whole village helped put up the fence. Ezra didn't ask any questions. He was old. He'd seen what was coming. He knew why the fence was needed. The logs were dug in deep. They were sharpened at the top. The gate was hinged and had a bolt. A ditch was dug on the outside and planted with rose thorns. A month later, Willowbrook ceased to be an open village. It became something else. Not a fortress, but not a target either. In August, Dan began building a bathhouse. It had been his idea from day one. A communal bathhouse. For everyone. Free of charge. He remembered something he'd read somewhere a long time ago, that in the Middle Ages, bathhouses were the center of social life, a place where people washed, sought healing, and talked, where ideas, deals, and friendships were born. Willowbrook needed a place like that. He built the bathhouse out of stone. The foundation was deep. The walls were thick to retain heat. Inside were 2 rooms, a changing room and a steam room. The stove was made of stone, a large one. Stones on the stove for steam. A trough with water for pouring over oneself. Benches made of linden wood. Linden doesn't burn the skin. Everyone who's built bathhouses in his world knows that. No one here knew that. The crew was working. 6 men now. Another one had joined the 5. A guy from a distant village. He heard about the mill and came. Dan taught them every step of the way. Not just how to build, how to think. Why this stone goes here and not there. Why does the door open outward and not inward? Why is the window here and not there? Every decision had a reason. Every reason had a logic to it. The crew was beginning to understand. Not all of them. Liam understood more than the others. He kept quiet and learned. Dan saw in him a future master. In a year or 2, Liam would be able to build on his own, without Dan. And that was the goal. Not to do the work for them, to teach them. A foreman's #1 rule. The sauna was ready by the end of September. They let the first steam in that evening. Dan had stoked the stove that morning. The stones were red hot. He splashed water on them. The steam shot up to the ceiling and filled the room. Hot, humid, authentic. Dan sat down on the bench. He closed his eyes. He took a deep breath. And for a single second, he was in Portland. In the sauna on Hawthorne Street where he used to go once a month after a tough week. The second passed. He was back in Willowbrook. But the bathhouse smelled the same. Of wood and steam and peace. The village arrived in the evening. Everyone. Old folks and children. Maggie burst in first and belted out a song from the very first bucketful. The children splashed and squealed. Old Thomas sat in the corner by the mill, silent, his eyes wet. Una said she couldn't remember the last time it had been so warm. Noriko sat on the edge, quietly. She took off her glasses. Without her glasses, her face looked different, softer, younger. She was smiling, rarely, but now she was smiling. Aelis sat next to Dan. Her feet were dipped in hot water. Steam swirled around them. She leaned toward him and spoke softly. She said that for 12,000 years she had kept the peace and didn't know that peace was this. He was silent. Then he said that now he knew. She rested her head on his shoulder. Outside the window, the first snow of autumn was falling. Early, quiet, flakes as big as feathers. And somewhere far away, very far away, above the clouds, one of the 7 pillars, a dream. For the first time in 1,000 years, he smiled, because he sensed it. His mother was happy, and that meant they would hold out a little longer. Dan fortified the village with hidden defensive structures using Emily's maps. Emily figured out his plan and offered to help. Dan built a communal bathhouse that became the center of village life. The Pillar of Sleep sensed that Aelis was happy. Willowbrook's reputation is growing and attracting attention. Gareth, the son of the village elder Ezra, returned to the village in October. He had left at the beginning of summer. He said he was going to the city to find work. Ezra didn't try to stop him. His father knew his son was angry. He'd been angry for a long time. Ever since that day when a stranger with calloused hands came to Willowbrook and, within half a year, became the one people listened to. Gareth had grown up as the village headman's eldest son. His whole life he'd been groomed for one thing, to become village headman after his father. To run the village. To be in charge. And then this stranger showed up. He fixed the well. He built the stoves. He built the mill. He built the bathhouse. He put together a crew. And now, when something breaks in the village, people don't go to Ezra. They go to Dan. Gareth watched all this all summer long and said nothing. He was silent, like a man with something rotting inside him. Dan saw it. He tried to talk to Gareth, twice. The first time, he offered him a job on the crew. Gareth refused. He looked at him as if he were a man offering the king a position as a servant. The second time, Dan asked for advice on where to build the bathhouse. Gareth knew the village well. He could have helped. Gareth replied curtly. He said the master would figure it out himself. After all, he knows everything. Dan didn't press the issue. There are people you can't fix like a door. You can only wait for them. Or not wait. Gareth left, and now he was back. With money, with new clothes, and with something else. Dan noticed it on the first evening. Gareth was sitting in his father's house, talking about the city, about the people he'd met, about work. He was talking loudly, cheerfully, but his eyes weren't smiling. And he wasn't looking at Dan, at all. As if Dan weren't even in the room. Dan recognized this kind of behavior. He'd seen it on construction sites. When a man has made a decision he's ashamed of and compensates for it with a show of confidence. A week after Gareth's return, a merchant drove into the village. He looked like an ordinary man. A wagon loaded with goods, fabrics, tableware, and salt. But Dan noticed the boots again. Good boots. And the hands. Not a merchant's hands. The merchant traded for 2 days. He asked questions about the village, about the craftsman, about his wife, cautiously, in passing, as if he were just making small talk. Dan watched. He didn't interfere. He waited. On the third night, Dan didn't sleep. He sat by the window. He looked out at the village. It was a full moon. Visibility was good. At 2 in the morning, he saw movement. At the south gate. Shadows. 5. No, 6. They moved silently. Professionally. Not village bandits. Mercenaries. Dan stood up. He woke Aelis with a single touch on her shoulder. She opened her eyes instantly, as if she hadn't been sleeping. He said one word. "They're here." She nodded. She stood up. He told her to go to the barn, the stone barn on the eastern edge, and get Hannah. Hannah had been living with them for a month already. A quiet 19-year-old girl who had come to the village in August, with empty eyes, without any belongings, without words. Dan took her onto the crew as an assistant, to carry tools, to make tea, to count nails. She didn't speak, not a word in 2 months, but she worked, every day, carefully, quietly. Every morning Dan would say, "Good morning, Hannah." Every evening he'd say, "Thank you, Hannah. See you tomorrow." She didn't answer, but she came every day. Aelis picked Hannah up, quietly, quickly. They went into the barn through the back door. Dan went to Ezra. He knocked the agreed-upon knock, 3 short, 2 long. They'd agreed on this a month ago, just in case. Ezra opened the door right away. He hadn't been sleeping either. He'd seen the shadows too. They rounded up 4 guys from the crew, quietly. No torches, no noise. Everyone knew their position. Dan had assigned them a month earlier. He'd shown each of them where to stand if anything happened at night. Back then, they'd laughed. Now they weren't laughing. The mercenaries entered through the south gate. The bolt had been opened from the inside. Dan knew by whom. Gareth. He found Gareth later. The boy was standing behind his father's house, in the dark. His hands were shaking. He realized what he'd done. He realized it the moment he saw that it wasn't a merchant with questions, but 6 armed men. But it was too late. The mercenaries had entered, and they found themselves in the village that was waiting for them. The first 2 turned into the passage between Ezra's and Maggie's houses. A dead end. Dan had designed that passage. The fence at the end looked like an ordinary fence, but behind it stood Liam with a pitchfork and 2 of the crew with axes. The mercenaries saw the dead end. They turned around, and Ezra was already standing behind them, with a crossbow. An old one, an antique, but it worked. 2 mercenaries surrendered without a fight. The 3rd and 4th headed toward Dan's house, to the empty house. They went inside. No one was there. They came out, and found themselves in the ditch that Dan had dug along the side of the house to drain rainwater. In the dark, the ditch was invisible. It was knee-deep. 1 fell. The 2nd tripped over the 1st. Maggie came out of the smithy with a hammer. Not a blacksmith's hammer, just an ordinary one. But in Maggie's hands, an ordinary hammer looked like a weapon. She stood over them and said that if they moved, she'd smash them flat. They didn't move. The 5th mercenary ran to the barn, to the stone barn on the eastern edge. The door was locked, an oak door. He rammed it with his shoulder. The door wouldn't budge. 3 bricks thick. An oak door. He could keep at it until morning. Dan approached from behind, quietly. The mercenary turned around. He saw a man in a shirt holding a hammer, not a sword, a hammer. A carpenter's hammer. The mercenary drew a knife. Dan looked at the knife, looked at the hammer, gauged the distance. 3 meters. The knife was longer. The mercenary was faster. The odds were against him. But Noriko came around the corner, quietly, like a shadow, with a little bag in her hand. She threw the bag in the mercenary's face. The bag burst open. Powder, pepper, and something else. Caustic. The mercenary clutched his eyes. He dropped the knife. Dan stepped forward and struck his hand with the hammer. Not on the head, on the arm. The mercenary fell. He screamed. His arm was broken. Dan picked up the knife. His hands were shaking. Then they stopped. They found the 6th man in the morning. He was stuck in a ditch lined with rose thorns behind the fence. In the dark, he ran the wrong way and stumbled into the very ditch Dan had dug around the village. The rose thorns held him fast like barbed wire. He screamed for 3 hours. No one came. It was a heavy morning. The 6 mercenaries were tied up in the square. The village stood all around. Their faces were serious. Dan interrogated the leader. He spoke reluctantly, but a broken arm and the prospect of spending another night in the rose thorns loosened his tongue. A man from the capital had sent them. He didn't give a name. The mission was simple. Pick up a man and a woman, alive, bring them to the capital. The reward was substantial. They didn't know who had hired them, but they knew who had tipped them off. A guy from the village, young, angry. He told them about the craftsman and his wife. He said the wife was unusual. Ezra stood nearby and listened. His face was stony. Then he turned to Gareth. Gareth was standing by the wall of his house. He hadn't run away. He hadn't hidden. He just stood there, staring at the ground. His hands were still shaking. The village was silent. Ezra walked over to his son. He stood in front of him. He looked at him for a long time. Then he said one word. Go. Gareth raised his head. He looked at his father. His eyes said it all. Shame, fear, and somewhere deep down, anger. Anger that hadn't gone away. Anger that had led him to this and would carry him onward. He turned. He walked away. He didn't look back. Ezra stood there, watching his back. Dan walked over. He stood beside him. He didn't say anything. He just stood there. Just like back then with Mark on the curb. Ezra stood there for 5 minutes. Then he turned and went home. Dan stayed the night at his place. He sat in a chair by the stove all night. Ezra slept in the next room. Or maybe he didn't. In the morning, they didn't talk about it. The mercenaries were let go, unarmed, without money, on foot, heading south. Dan told the foreman to tell the employer that there was nothing of interest in Willowbrook, just a mill and a boring miller who loves to talk about gutters. The mercenary looked at his broken arm, then at Dan, then at the village with its log fence, a ditch lined with rose hips, and dead-end alleys between the houses. He nodded. He left. Gareth, the village headman's son, out of spite, led a group of mercenaries sent from the capital to attack the village. Thanks to his pre-prepared fortifications and the positioning of his men, Dan repelled the attack without any casualties. Gareth was banished from the village. Noriko helped Dan neutralize the mercenary by the barn. Someone in the capital is looking for Dan and Aelis. After the attack, Dan hadn't slept properly for 3 nights, not out of fear, out of calculation. He lay in the dark and counted. 6 mercenaries meant a reconnaissance mission, not an assault. Someone was testing the waters to see if the prize was worth the cost. If the mercenaries returned and reported that the village had put up a fight, next time there wouldn't be 6, there would be 30, with archers. And no ditch lined with rose thorns would help. He needed time. And he needed the village to continue looking ordinary, boring, insignificant. He started simple. He sent Emily to 2 neighboring villages with maps. The official reason, to propose a joint grain trade through the Willowbrook mill. The real reason, to scout the roads, to find out where they could approach unnoticed, and to establish contact. If anything happened, the neighbors needed to know. Emily was gone for 4 days. She returned with 3 maps and 4 new orders for milling, and with news. The neighboring villages had also heard about strangers searching for someone. Monks, hunters, merchants. All of them were dressed far too well for their roles. The Order of the Morning Star was expanding its search. Dan thought it over for 2 days, then he called a meeting. Not a formal one, he just called people over to his place that evening. Ezra, Maggie, Noriko, Emily, and Aelis. He didn't tell them everything. He told them that people from the capital were looking for him, that he wasn't a criminal, that it was because of his wife, and that Aelis was special. He didn't specify how. He said that if they found him, they'd take them both away and things might get worse for the village. Ezra was silent. Maggie said the village had survived raids even before the master came, that it would survive this one too, that the master could go wherever he wanted, but Willowbrook would stand its ground. Then she added that the master wouldn't go anywhere, because she has a son whom the master is teaching, and if the master leaves, she'll find him and drag him back by the ear. Dan looked at her. Maggie looked at him the way a mother looks at her grown son who's about to do something foolish. He nodded. Noriko said she had sleeping powders and emetic potions, enough for 20 people if needed. Emily said she had a map of every trail within a 3-day journey, every ford, and every narrow pass. Aelis was silent. Then she said one thing, that no one was looking for her in the village. They were looking in the cities, in the temples, in the castles, because no one believes that the Mother Goddess would live in a village of 43 families and wash dishes. That's their main defense. Absurdity. No one will believe it. Dan looked at her. She was right. The safest hiding place is where no one is looking for you. And no one looks for you where you don't belong. A goddess in a village is like a foreman on a throne. Absurdity. Absurdity that works. Fall turned to winter. Dan's second winter in Etherlyn. The village was better prepared than last time. All the stoves were working. All the roofs were sturdy. There was an abundance of firewood. The mill was grinding. The bathhouse was warm. The well was clean. And new people had arrived in the village, 3 families from a neighboring village where 2 houses had collapsed the previous winter. They'd heard about Willowbrook, about the clean water and warm houses. They came with their children and their belongings. Dan took them in. He found them a place. He helped them build their homes. Quickly, before the frost set in. 3 houses in 3 weeks. The crew worked like clockwork. Liam led the second team, all by himself. Dan checked on them in the evening and fixed the little things, but there were fewer and fewer little things. Liam was learning. Hannah had changed too. She still didn't speak, but she started doing things without being told. She saw what needed to be done and did it. The tools were sharpened before the crew even arrived. The water was heated. The nails were sorted by size. Every evening, Dan would see her and say, "Thanks, Hannah. See you tomorrow." She'd nod. And one day, early in the winter, he said, as usual, "Thanks, Hannah. See you tomorrow." And she replied, quietly, barely audible, "See you tomorrow." 2 words. Dan didn't stop. He didn't turn around. He didn't make a big deal out of it. He just nodded and walked away. Because he knew that if he made a big deal out of it, she'd fall silent again. He had to act like it was normal, like it had always been that way. He came home, sat down at the table, and Aelis saw his face. She asked what had happened. He said that Hannah had spoken. Aelis froze. Then she sat down across from him, and she cried. Quietly, silently. Tears streamed down her face, and she didn't wipe them away. Dan asked why she was crying. She said that for 12,000 years she had heard millions of voices, millions of names, millions of words, and not a single one of them was like these 2. Until tomorrow. Because these 2 words weren't spoken to her, not to the goddess, not to the pillar, not to power. They were spoken by a quiet girl to a tired man one evening after work. And that was more important than all the prayers of the past 12,000 years. Dan reached his hand across the table. She took it. They sat like that, in silence. Snow outside the window, a fire in the stove, Frank's spider in the corner. A normal evening, an ordinary one. And that's exactly why it was important. Winter was setting in. Dan was working less than in the summer. There aren't any big construction projects in the winter. But there were little jobs. There were always little jobs. Thomas's door was coming loose. Maggie's gutter was leaking. The new settler's wagon had broken. Dan fixed them, every day. He'd come by, take a look, fix it, leave. Sometimes for a thank you, sometimes for a glass of milk, sometimes for nothing. One winter evening, he was sitting in the bathhouse with Ezra. Just the 2 of them. Everyone else had left. The steam was heavy, hot. "Well," Ezra said silently. Then he said he didn't know how to thank the master, that the village had changed over the past year, that people had stopped fearing winter, that the children were healthy, that he was old and had seen a lot, but had never seen anything like this. Dan said he was just doing what he knew how to do. Ezra shook his head. He said it wasn't about skill, that there had been craftsmen in the village before, but those craftsmen made things for themselves. The master, however, makes things for people. Every item is for a specific person. A stove for Una so the old woman wouldn't freeze. Shelves for Noriko to hold her jars. A roof for Maggie so Liam could learn. A mill for the village. A bathhouse for everyone. Every object is a letter. Ezra said that word. Letter. Dan looked at him. Ezra was smarter than he seemed. Much smarter. They sat in silence for another half hour. Then Dan stood up. His back, his knees, his shoulder. He was 39, almost 40. His body reminded him of that every day. He stepped out of the bathhouse into the frosty air. Aelis was waiting by the door, holding a warm coat. She draped the coat over his shoulders. He looked at her. She was smiling. Not a goddess, not the pillar, not a higher power. Just a woman waiting for her husband to come out of the bathhouse, who had brought him a coat so he wouldn't freeze. He took her by the hand. They walked home. Through the snow, in silence. And it was a good silence. Dan prepared the village for a possible second attack by scouting the roads and forming an alliance with neighboring villages. At the council meeting, his inner circle learned that people from the capital were searching for Dan. Aelis explained that their main defense lay in the absurdity of the situation, because no one would believe that a goddess lived in a village. For the first time, Hana spoke, uttering just 2 words. The village had grown by 3 families and successfully survived its second winter. Spring of the second year began with a guest. She came from the south, a tall woman with a long black braid and a straight back. Dressed in a gray traveling gown without any adornments, but her posture gave her away. That's how people who are used to wearing ceremonial garments walk. The body remembers the weight of the fabric even when there is no fabric. She entered the village through the southern gate. She stopped in the square. She looked around. She looked at the well with its new log casing, at the gravel road, at the rain gutters, at the fence, at the bathhouse, at the mill by the stream. Then she turned toward Dan's house and walked straight toward it, without asking for directions, without looking back, straight ahead. Dan was on the roof. He was replacing the shingles that had been pitted by hail the previous week. He saw her from above. He saw her walking, and he realized, she knows. He climbed down. He stood at the door. The woman stopped 3 steps away. She looked at him. Her eyes were dark, intelligent, cold. She introduced herself as Seun-Ah Park, a former priestess of the Order of the Morning Star, excommunicated for the heresy of doubt. She said this in an even voice, without shame, without pain, as a matter of fact. Then she said she knew who lived in this house, and that she had come neither in peace nor in war. She had come with the truth. Dan asked what truth. Seun-Ah said that the Mother Goddess Aelis had abandoned her post, that the 7 pillars are holding up the world without her, that the pillar of memory is growing weak, that in the north, Norvain's oblivion is spreading. Villages are losing their names. Rivers are changing course. People are waking up and not recognizing those who slept beside them. That the southern provinces were yielding 2/3 of the harvest. That there had been famine in the 3 kingdoms that winter. That the order was searching for the goddess because the world was falling apart. She didn't shout as she spoke. Quietly, poetically. Every word in its place, like a sermon rehearsed 1,000 times, and every word was true. Dan stood there listening. The door behind him opened. Aelis stepped out. Seun-Ah saw her and froze. Her eyes widened. Her lips trembled. She looked at Aelis like a person who had prayed to an icon all her life and suddenly saw that the icon was alive, that she was standing barefoot on the porch of a village house, wearing an apron with flour on her cheek. Aelis looked at her, quietly, intently. Then she said a name, Seun-Ah. And in that name lay everything Seun-Ah had forgotten about herself. The 6-year-old girl who entered the temple for the first time and burst into tears at its beauty. The 12-year-old novice who had memorized all the hymns in a single year. A 20-year-old priestess who had her first doubts and couldn't stop herself. 29 years of life in a single name. Seuna fell to her knees, not out of reverence, out of the weight of it all. Because for 20 years she had served gods she had stopped believing in, and now the goddess stood before her in an apron and knew her name. Aelis stepped down from the porch. She approached. She crouched down before her. She took her hand. She said she knew, that she had always known, that Seuna was no heretic, that doubt was not a sin. That doubt was the only proof that the mind was alive. Seuna raised her head. Tears streamed down her face. Her voice broke. She asked why. Why had Aelis left? Why had she abandoned the world? For what? Aelis was silent for a moment. Then she turned and looked at Dan. He was standing on the porch with a hammer in his hand, wearing an old shirt, with a blue nail on his thumb. Aelis turned back to Seuna and said it was for this. Seuna looked at Dan, then at Aelis, then at Dan again, at the man with the hammer, and she didn't understand. Aelis said that understanding would come, that she needed to stay, that the village needed a teacher, that the children couldn't read or count, that Seuna could do both better than anyone Aelis had known in 12,000 years. Seuna was silent. Then she stood up. She wiped her face. She straightened her back. She said she hadn't come to stay, that she'd come to bring back the goddess. Aelis said she knew, and she repeated, "Stay." Dan intervened. He asked Seuna if she knew how to keep track of the grain. She looked at him as if he were a person asking a surgeon if he knew how to cut bread. He nodded. He said the village needed record-keeping, a school for the children, someone who could read and count and speak in a way that made people listen. He said there was no money to pay her, but she would have a place to live, food to eat, and work to do. Seuna looked at him. She didn't understand this man. She didn't understand how anyone could stand before a former priestess who had come to accuse him and offer her a job as an accountant. She stayed. Not that day. 3 days later. For 3 days she lived in Emily's house. For 3 days she walked around the village. She looked. At the mill. At the bathhouse. At the children who never got sick. At the elderly who never froze. At the woman who had been a goddess and who went out into the yard every morning to feed the chickens and greeted each one by name. At the man who came home from work every evening, sat on the porch, drank water from a mug, and said nothing. And his wife would sit beside him, and they sat in silence together. On the 3rd evening, Seuna came to Dan. She said she was staying. She said she needed a room and a blackboard for the school. Dan nodded. He said the room would be ready by Friday, and she could make the blackboard herself from a piece of slate in the stream. Shuna opened the school a week later. 14 children. She taught them to read and count and told them stories about the world, without religion, without gods, just about the world, about rivers and mountains and people. The children were afraid of her the first week, a strict aunt with a long braid and a voice that made you want to sit right down. Then they got used to her. Then they grew to love her. Because behind her strictness, Shuna hid the same thing Maggie hid behind her cursing. Tenderness. A great tenderness she'd had nowhere to put for 20 years. But now she had a place for it. And one more thing. Shuna knew the truth about Aelis, the only one besides Dan. And she guarded that secret fanatically. Not out of duty, out of understanding. She spent 3 days watching the goddess in an apron. And she realized what she had come to disprove. Aelis hadn't been kidnapped. Aelis wasn't insane. For the first time in 12,000 years, Aelis was happy. And Shuna decided she would protect that happiness. At any cost. Because if the goddess doesn't deserve happiness, then who does? Former priestess Sun-Ah Park came to Willowbrook to return Aelis to her post. Aelis convinced her to stay, and Sun-Ah became a teacher. She learned the truth about the goddess and resolved to protect her secret. Dan learned from Sun-Ah the scale of the world's problems. Norvain's oblivion is spreading and the pillars are weakening. Summer brought heat and anxiety. Not in Willowbrook, in the world around it. Dan could sense it from the people who were coming. Refugees, in groups of 2 or 3, families, with children in their arms and belongings in carts, from the northern provinces, from places where Norvain's oblivion had reached the villages. They all told the same story. At first it was small things. A neighbor had forgotten his wife's name. Then the river changed course. Then the bread started going bad overnight. Then you wake up in the morning and don't recognize the house where you grew up. And then you run. Anywhere. South. Willowbrook took in 14 families over the summer. Dan didn't ask for permission. Ezra didn't object. The crew built. Liam led the second crew. 3 houses, 5 houses, 8. Willowbrook was growing. New houses and new streets appeared on Emily's map. Dan designed every street. Width, slope, drainage, lines of sight. He no longer hid the defensive purpose of the layout. People knew. People accepted it. The world outside the village was becoming more dangerous, and a village that could defend itself was not a curiosity, but a necessity. In July, Aelis began to change. Dan noticed it in the little things. She became quieter. She stood by the window longer in the mornings. She looked north. Once he woke up in the middle of the night and saw her sitting on the edge of the bed. Her back was straight. Her eyes were open. She was staring at the wall. He didn't disturb her. He just lay back down and put his hand on her back. A minute later, she lay down. In the morning, he asked how she was. She said she was fine. He said that wasn't an answer. She looked at him for a long time. Then she told the truth. She can feel them. Every name that disappears. Every person that oblivion erases. She's not at her post. She's not holding the world together, but she's still connected to him. And every lost name is like a hair being pulled out, one by one, dozens a day. She feels every single one. Dan sat at the table and listened, his hands clenched into fists. Not out of anger, out of helplessness. He could fix the house, fix the well, build a mill, but he couldn't fix the world. He asked how many names a day. She said she didn't count them, because if she started counting, she wouldn't be able to stay. He understood. He stood up. He embraced her, silently. She stood in his arms and for the first time ever trembled. Not from the cold. In August, something happened that changed everything. The mercenaries came again. Not 6, 20. With archers, on horseback. Riding at the head was a man in armor bearing the coat of arms of the Order of the Morning Star. Not a monk, a knight. Behind him was a convoy. Professional. Dan saw them from the hill. Dust on the road. 10 minutes to the village. Maybe 15. He ran home. He couldn't remember the last time he'd run. His body protested. His shoulder, his knees. He didn't care. He made it. Aelis was in the garden, picking cucumbers. He said one word. 20. She set the basket down on the ground. She straightened up. She looked north, then at him, and she said that was enough, that she wouldn't hide in the attic, that she wouldn't let those people touch the village. Dan said they'd overwhelm them with numbers, that 20 professionals weren't the same as 6 mercenaries in the dark, that the ditch and the rose bushes wouldn't help. She said she knew, and that she wasn't going to use the ditch. She walked out through the gate, alone, wearing an apron, with flour on her hands, barefoot. Dan followed her, not because he could help, because a husband follows his wife. The horsemen saw the woman on the road. They stopped. The knight at the head raised his hand. The convoy froze. 20 men, spears, bows, swords, armor, and before them, a woman in an apron. Aelis stood on the road and looked at the knight. Then she changed, not instantly, slowly, like dawn. Her hair grew brighter, her skin glowed, not with gold, with something deeper, that light that existed before gold, before the sun, before fire. Her eyes became such that you couldn't look into them, yet you couldn't look away. The dress, once a simple apron, became something for which no words exist. She grew taller, not in stature, but in presence. That very presence she had let go of on her first day in the temple. It had returned. For a moment. For just one moment. 20 mounted warriors stared at her. The horses backed away. One reared up. 3 spears fell to the ground because the hands holding them had stopped obeying. The knight at the head turned pale. He knew what he was seeing. Every priest and every knight of the order knew the description. Copper-colored hair, eyes in which one drowns, a light that does not exist. The goddess Ma Aelis, the 8th pillar, she who remembers every name. She stood before him on the village road, barefoot, with flour on her hands, and she said, "Go." One word. The ground beneath his feet trembled. The knight turned his horse around. The convoy turned around. They rode away, in silence, quickly, without looking back. Aelith stood on the road. The light was fading, slowly, like a sunset. She was growing smaller, more ordinary, a woman again, in an apron, barefoot, with flour on her hands. She turned to Dan, and he saw something he had never seen before. The face of a goddess who had just revealed her true nature. And the face of a woman who knew she had just changed everything, because now they knew where she was. Now the entire order would know. Now all 30 kingdoms would know. She could no longer hide. Dan walked up to her. He took her hand. It was ice cold. She was trembling. He said they'd figure it out. She looked at him. She asked, how? He said, as usual, slowly and calmly. She didn't smile, but her fingers squeezed his hand tighter. They went back inside. They sat on the porch. They were silent. Beyond the gate, dust from 20 horses settled on the road. The village was quiet. People had seen it. Everyone had seen it. They'd come out of their houses and were standing in the street, watching the woman on the porch who washed dishes with them and fed the chickens by name, and who had just turned 20 warriors around with a single word. Maggie was the first to approach. She stood in front of the porch. She looked at Aelis. Then she said she'd always known the master's wife was no ordinary woman, and that if Aelis taught her that trick with the light, she'd show her the proper way to salt cabbage in return. Aelis looked at her and laughed. That same laugh from the temple, with a snort, her hand covering her mouth. The order's detachment of 20 warriors approached the village. For the first time in front of everyone, Aelis took on her true form and, with a single word, turned them away. The whole village learned who she was. It was no longer possible to hide. The knights would report the goddesses, the mother. The village knew, and the village remained silent. No one ran to the temple to report it. No one fell to their knees before Aelis. No one asked for a miracle. The next day, Maggie came with heads of cabbage and spent 3 hours teaching Aelis how to pickle them. Aelis listened like a little girl, seriously, intently. The Mother Goddess, 12,000 years old, listened to the blacksmith's widow, 40 years her junior, and nodded. Maggie gave orders. More salt, less water, press harder. And Aelis pressed the cabbage with the expression of a military commander. Dan watched from the window and thought this was the strangest and most right thing he'd ever seen in his life. Nordico came in the evening, silently. She placed a little bag of sleep-inducing herbs on the table. For Aelis. She could see that Aelis wasn't sleeping. She didn't ask why the goddess wasn't sleeping. She just brought the herbs. Aelis took the little bag. She looked at Noriko. "Sister Noriko," she said. Noriko adjusted her glasses. She turned away. She left quickly. Dan thought Noriko had left so quickly because of her tears, but he didn't ask. Seuna reacted differently. She came to Dan's workshop. She closed the door. She sat down on the workbench, and she began to speak, quickly, clearly, without emotion. She said that in 2 weeks, High Priest Caleb Whitmore himself would arrive in Willowbrook, the head of the Order of the Morning Star, the most influential religious leader in the 30 kingdoms. A man who, for 30 years, has believed that his mission is to serve the Mother Goddess and protect the world from collapse. A man who is now convinced that Aelis has been kidnapped, that Dan is the kidnapper, that the world is falling apart because of one selfish mortal. Caleb won't come with just 20 warriors. He'll come with an army. Dan listened. Then he asked what she was suggesting. Seuna said to run. Dan shook his head. Seuna said she was serious. Dan said he was serious too, that he wouldn't run away, that he'd spent 2 years building this village, that this was his home, that this was where his mill and his bathhouse and his crew and his people were, that this was where Una was, who for the first time in 10 years wasn't freezing, Enid, whose daughters were going to school, Hana, who had laughed for the first time yesterday. He wouldn't run away. Seuna looked at him. Then she said quietly that she understood now. She understood why Aelis had chosen him. He asked what she meant. She said it didn't matter, that they needed a plan. They spent 3 days making a plan. Dan, Seuna, Emily, Aelis, Noriko, Maggie, Ezra. Every evening at the table in Dan's house, Emily's maps on the wall, Seuna's notes on the order's structure, Noriko's lists of potion supplies. Maggie growled that they'd just have to try to get close. Ezra remained silent and listened, and sometimes spoke a single sentence that changed the entire plan. The old man had seen wars. He knew how commanders thought. Dan pieced it all together. Like a foreman, everyone in their place, every skill put to use. But this wasn't a military plan. Dan wasn't going to fight the Order's army. He was going to do what he always did, show people the truth. Simple, obvious, irrefutable. Caleb Whitmore believes that Aelis has been kidnapped, so we have to show him that Aelis is free. Not with words, with actions. Let him come. Let him see the village. Let him see the house, the mill, the bathhouse, the school. Let him see the woman who feeds the chickens by name, pickles cabbage with Maggie, and listens to talk about ventilation with genuine interest. Let him see and understand. Sona said that Caleb wouldn't understand, that he's a fanatic, that he believes in his mission as if it were the air he breathes. Dan said that a fanatic is someone who believes because he hasn't seen the truth. Show him the truth, and his faith will either grow stronger or break. There's no third option. Aelis was silent all evening. Then, when everyone had left, she told Dan something he didn't know. She said she knew Caleb, that she remembered him, that he was 6 when he prayed to her for the first time. His mother was dying. He was kneeling in the temple and begging the way children do, with all his heart, without a doubt, with absolute faith that she would hear him and save him. She heard him. She couldn't save him. Caleb's mother died the next day, and the boy never stopped believing. He believed even more strongly. He decided that serving wasn't enough, that more was needed. For 30 years, he served so that she would never lose anyone else. For 30 years, he carried that burden. And now he's coming here with an army because he believes he's saving her. Dan listened. Then he said it was the saddest story he'd ever heard. She nodded. She said she had 12,000 years worth of stories like that, and that every one of them hurt. He took her hand. He said they wouldn't fight Caleb. They would show him the truth. And if the truth broke him, they would help him get back on his feet, just as they help everyone in this village. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said he was the best person she knew. He said she'd already said that. She said she'd repeat it as many times as it took. They went to bed. Aelis drank Noriko's herbal tea and, for the first time in a month, fell asleep before Dan. He lay in the dark and listened to her breathing. Steady. Calm. And he thought that for the sake of that breathing, he was ready to face even 1,000 high priests. The village accepted the truth about Aelis calmly and without reverence. Seuna warned that High Priest Caleb Whitmore was coming with an army. Dan decided not to flee or fight, but to show Caleb the truth. Aelis told Caleb's story, a boy who had lost his mother and had served the goddess for 30 years so that she would never lose anyone else. The plan revolved around a meeting, not a battle. Caleb Whitmore arrived 10 days later, not in 2 weeks as Seuna had predicted, but sooner. An army of 200 men, infantry, cavalry, archers. The banners of the Order of the Morning Star, white with a golden sun. They set up camp in a field beyond the village. Dan saw the camp from a hillock. 200 tents, 200 campfires, 200 men who had come to take his wife away. He stood there watching and thought that 200 tents amounted to roughly 40 cubic meters of fabric, 500 tent stakes, and 400 guy ropes, and that the camp was set up crookedly. The wind was blowing from the east, yet the tents were facing east. By morning, half of them would be flooded if it rained. An old habit, seeing how things are done. Caleb had sent a messenger. A single rider, unarmed, a white flag. The messenger delivered the demand. High Priest Caleb Whitmore, in the name of the 30 kingdoms and the 7 pillars, demands the surrender of the Mother Goddess Aelis and her abductor. The deadline is dawn. Dan listened to the messenger. He nodded. He said the High Priest could come tomorrow morning, alone, unarmed, to the village, for breakfast. The messenger blinked. He asked again. Dan repeated himself. Breakfast, in the morning, alone. The messenger rode off. The evening was spent making preparations, not military ones, culinary preparations. Aelis cooked. Bread, plain, without a glow. She'd learned how to make it over the past 2 years. Porridge, eggs, milk, honey. Maggie brought butter. Noriko brought mint for tea. Dan set up a table in the courtyard. A large table made of planks on trestles. Benches, seating for 8 people. In the morning, Caleb arrived. Alone, just as he'd been described. Tall, lean, about 50 years old. A stern face, gray eyes. Cold. White clothes with gold embroidery. Hands clasped behind his back. The gait of a man accustomed to people parting before him. He walked through the Willowbrook gate, stopped, looked around, at the houses, at the streets, at the mill, at the bathhouse, at the well, at the children running to school, paying him no mind, at old Thomas on the bench, at Maggie, who was walking with a bucket and nodded to him as she would to any passerby. Caleb walked through the village and his expression changed, slowly. He had expected a dungeon, or a lair, or something explainable. Something that would confirm the picture in his head. A villain had kidnapped a goddess. He was holding her captive. The world was falling apart. He had come to save it. Instead, he saw a village. Clean, well-fed, alive, with a mill by the stream, a bathhouse by the square, and a school from which came the voice of Seuna teaching the children their letters. He reached Dan's house. In the yard, a table, set. Bread, porridge, eggs, steam rising from the teapot. Aelis stood at the table, in a simple dress, her hair tied back, her apron off, but her hands were covered in flour. She hadn't had time to wash them. Caleb saw her and stopped. He froze, like a man who'd been struck. He looked at her, at the woman with flour on her hands, at the goddess he'd prayed to for 30 years, the one he'd prayed to when his mother was dying, the one he'd prayed to every day since then. She stood before him, alive, real, with flour on her hands, in the village, next to a man in a work shirt who was setting a pitcher of milk on the table. Aelis said his name, Caleb, just as she had said Seuna's name, with the same weight, with the same memory. In his name was a 6-year-old boy on his knees in the temple. Caleb staggered. He didn't fall. 30 years of discipline kept him from falling, but he staggered. Dan said breakfast was getting cold. Let the high priest sit down. Caleb sat down, mechanically, as if in a dream. Aelis sat across from him. Dan sat next to her. They ate in silence. Caleb didn't eat. He stared at the bread, at Aelis's hands, at the flour on her fingers. Then he asked quietly, his voice faltered for the first time in 30 years. He asked why. Aelis set down the bread. She looked at him. and began to speak. She spoke softly, about 1,000 years of loneliness, about the millions of names she remembered and that no one cared about the prayers that came every day, requests, demands, pleas, and not a single prayer in 12,000 years had asked how she was. Not one. Until this man. She pointed at Dan, who comes home from work every evening and asks, "How are you?" and listens to the answer. Caleb looked at Dan, at the man with a blue fingernail and calluses, at the foreman from another world. Aelis said she remembered him. She remembered the 6-year-old boy. She remembered his prayer. She remembered his mother. She remembers that she couldn't save him, and that ever since then he has served her so that she would never lose anyone else, and that she knows, and that she's sorry, and that she's tired, and that she chooses to stay. Here, with this man, in this village, and she asks for forgiveness. Caleb bowed his head. His shoulders trembled. 30 years. 30 years of faith. 30 years of service. 30 years of being certain that his mission was to save the world through her. And she's sitting across from him saying she's tired, that she wants peace, that she's choosing the man with the hammer. He began to cry. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't quiet. He cried like a man who hadn't cried in 30 years and didn't remember how. Awkwardly. Loudly. Shaking. Dan stood up. He went into the house. He came back with a towel. He placed it next to Caleb. He didn't try to comfort him. Some things require space. Caleb cried for 10 minutes. Then he wiped his face. He lifted his head. He looked at Aelis. He looked at Dan. He looked at the village around them, at the mill spinning by the stream, at the children at school, at the old man on the bench. Then he said quietly that the world was falling apart, that oblivion was coming, that the pillars were weakening, that without her everything would fall apart. Aelis nodded. She said she knew. Caleb asked what she was going to do. She turned to Dan. Dan looked at her, and he understood, right at that very moment. He understood what he'd known for a long time but hadn't put into words. That one day she'd have to return, that the world wouldn't survive without her, and that his task wasn't to keep her here but to go with her. He told Caleb they needed time, just a little, to prepare. Caleb asked what for. Dan said it was for the expedition to Northspire. Caleb looked at him, then at Aelis, then at the hammer lying on the bench by the house. Then he said it was madness, and that he wouldn't stand in their way. And he left. The army broke camp the next day. Caleb didn't become a friend, but he stopped being an enemy. That was enough. High Priest Caleb arrived with an army of 200 men. Dan invited him to breakfast. Aelis told Caleb the truth about her choice and about his childhood prayer. Caleb broke down and cried, but accepted her decision. Dan realized that Aelis had to return to her duty and decided to go with her to Northspire. The Order's army had left. Dan spent 2 weeks preparing for the expedition. He took his time. Dan Hayes never did anything in a hurry. He did things right. First things first, the crew. Liam could oversee the construction on his own. Dan put him to the test. He gave him 3 tasks at once. Liam managed. Slower than Dan, but he managed. The mistakes were minor, the kind that wouldn't bring the house down, but would just make the door a little tighter than it needed to be. Liam will learn. He has time. The mill ran on its own. Dan taught 2 men how to maintain the machinery, to lubricate the axle, check the blades, and sharpen the millstones once a season. He wrote up instructions, on birch bark in large letters, and hung them on the wall inside the mill, the first written instructions in the history of Willowbrook. Seun-Ah read it and said it was the best document she'd seen in her 20 years in the Order. Dan said it was just a memo. She said that was exactly why. Seun-Ah ran the school with confidence. 22 students now, all the village children. They read, they count. Some of them write. Enid's youngest daughter solves problems faster than anyone else, and Seun-ah looks at her with an expression Dan recognized. That's how a master looks at talent. Seun-ah kept track of the grain. Emily updated the maps. Noriko prepared the potions. Maggie ran the blacksmith shop. Liam built. Ezra managed. Everyone was in their place. Every role was held firmly. The village no longer depended on a single master. It had become what Dan had been building from day one, a community. One that is sustained by its people, on knowledge, on the fact that everyone knows how to do their job and understands why they do it that way. Not because that's how their grandfathers built things, but because that's the right way. And everyone can explain why. That was Dan's legacy. Not a house, not a mill, not a bathhouse. Knowledge. Passed down from hand to hand, from mind to mind. Knowledge that won't disappear when he's gone. On the morning of the gathering, Dan got up before everyone else. He went out into the yard. He looked at his house. The house he'd built with his own hands. A window facing east because Aelis loves the morning. A stove with an air duct. A floor that doesn't creak. A door that closes smoothly. Every plank, every stone, every nail. He knew them all. Just as one knows one's children. Then he looked out at the village. Willowbrook. 57 families. The mill. The bathhouse. A school. A clean well. A fence with rose hips. Streets with drainage. Houses with good stoves. 2 years ago, there had been 30 houses here with rotten roofs and a well that had been poisoning people for 120 years. Now it was a place. A real place. A place where he wouldn't be afraid to bring his family. A place where the elderly don't freeze and children don't get sick. A place that stands firm, solid, like the things Dan had built his whole life. Hannah stepped out into the yard. 21 years old. She had grown up, not physically, on the inside. 2 years ago, she'd come to the village without words and without eyes, empty, broken. Now she stood in the yard, holding the horse's reins, calm, confident. She looked at Dan, said good morning. He said, "Good morning, Hannah." She smiled, a normal smile. The smile of someone who knows that he's right where he should be. Noriko came with a little bag, remedies for aches and pains, for colds, for wounds, for insomnia, a 3-month supply. She handed the bag to Dan. Their hands touched. She held it there for a second. Then she pulled her hand away. She adjusted her glasses. She said that if anything happened to the little bag, she'd come personally and scold him like a little boy. He said he had no doubt. She turned to Aelis. She bowed, not as if to a goddess, as to an older sister. She said, "Take care of him." Aelis said, "Sister Noriko." Noriko left, quickly, because dust was getting in her eyes. Dust, as always. Maggie didn't stand on ceremony. She walked over. She hugged Dan so hard his shoulder cracked. Then she let go. She wiped her eyes with her sleeve. She said it was dust, that there's always dust here, that she'd curse him if he didn't come back. Then she hugged Aelis, more gently, but just as tightly. She whispered something in her ear. Aelis blushed. For the first time in 12,000 years, she blushed. Maggie left, satisfied. Liam stood off to the side. He was silent, as always. Dan walked over to him. He looked at him. The guy was 18, broad-shouldered. His hands were steady. A master. Young, but a master. Dan said the village was counting on him. Liam nodded. Dan said that if the roof on Una's house started to sag, he should check the second rafter on the left. He'd noticed a crack last week. Liam nodded. Dan wanted to say something else. He couldn't. He just put his hand on the guy's shoulder, held it there for 3 seconds. Then he took it away. Liam nodded. That was enough. Emily unfolded a map, a large one, the route to North Spire. A 3-month journey, through 4 provinces. through lands where oblivion had already eroded the roads and erased the names of the rivers. She had drawn every turn, every ford, every place to spend the night. The map was flawless. She handed it to Dan and said it was the best map she'd ever drawn in her life, and that his goddess was awesome, and that he should take good care of her. Dan said he would. Seuna blessed them. For the first time in 10 years, she spoke a blessing, and for the first time in 10 years, the words were genuine. Not a ritual, not a formula. Words that flowed from one person to others. She stood tall, with a long black braid, with teary eyes, and her voice didn't waver. Ezra was the last to approach, an old man, a beard with crumbs in it, heavy hands. He placed a hand on Dan's shoulder. He said nothing. He held it there. Then he withdrew it. Dan nodded. No words were needed. A cart stood in the yard. In the cart were tools, a level, a hammer, a rope, nails, a saw, a chisel, pliers, Noriko's little bag, Emily's map, Seuna's blessing, El Magi in a barrel, the cabbage that Alice had learned to pickle. Dan looked at the wagon. He looked at the tools. His tools. Not a sword, a hammer. Not magic, hands. Not heroism, work. Elise stood nearby, in her traveling dress, the very same one, the gray one, the one they'd worn when they left the temple 2 years ago. Only now the dress was patched at the elbow, and a cabbage stain on the hem. She looked at Dan. He looked at her. 2 years. 2 years ago, he'd woken up in a marble hall and asked simply to live, peacefully. He'd gotten more. He'd gotten a home, a wife, a family, a village, people. He'd gotten a place in the world. In this strange, foreign world without electricity and with crooked stoves. He got a life. A second one. A better one. He turned to her. To his wife. To the Mother Goddess. To Aelis. To the only name he truly knew. And he said what he always said when he started a new project. When he stood before the crew with a blueprint in his hand and the sight at his feet. He said it simply, calmly, like a foreman. Well then, my love, let's go fix the world. Our way. Slowly and steadily. She nodded. They got into the wagon. Hana urged the horse on. The wagon rolled down the road toward the north. The village watched them go, in silence. Maggie cursed at the dust. Noriko adjusted her glasses. Seuna stood upright. Emily waved both hands. Liam was silent. Ezra sat on a bench and watched. The wagon climbed the hill. Dan turned around. He looked at Willowbrook, at his village, at his home, at his people. Then he turned forward, toward the road, northward, toward the spire, toward the rift in the world, toward his work. Aelis sat beside him, shoulder to shoulder, warm, alive, her hand in his. And far above the clouds, above the pillars, above everything. The 7 pillars exhaled in unison, because she was coming, and he was walking with her. And the snow on the northern spire began to melt for the first time in 1,000 years. Not by magic, not by a miracle, not by divine power. Simply because a wagon was traveling north along the road. In the wagon lay a hammer, a level, a rope, and nails. Walking beside the wagon was a girl who, 2 years ago, hadn't spoken a word, but was now singing a quiet song. On the box sat a 39-year-old man with bad knees and a blue nail on his thumb. His wife sat beside him. 12,000 years and 2 years. A goddess and a woman. The world and home. Everything and one. They were traveling to mend the world, just as they mended a well, just as they mended a roof, just as they mended everything. Slowly, calmly, properly. And the world was waiting. Because for the first time in 1,000 years, it wasn't a hero with a sword coming to it. A craftsman with a hammer was coming to it. And a craftsman with a hammer is better. Because a hero defeats the enemy, but a craftsman fixes what's broken. And after the craftsman, things remain intact.